Hello. Today I have the pleasure to conduct an interview with Dr. Grabbe, the director of the Open Society European Policy Institute. Dr. Grabbe, thank you very much for being here today. It's a real pleasure and an honor to have this interview with you. We would like to start by discussing an important issue, and that's EU enlargement. It seems that with the persistent enlargement fatigue, the transformative power of Europe is decreasing in the Western Balkans and in other regions such as Turkey. What are the tools that the EU should employ to revive enlargement?
The Western Balkans have and are having a long and winding road towards EU membership. I personally think that eventually they will get there because the Western Balkans already is in the European Union in the sense of being geographically surrounded by EU countries and also having economies and societies that are deeply integrated already with EU markets and also with EU civil society. The question is how long formal accession might take and in what order the countries might join, whether they join separately or they join all together. These are still the big questions, and the fact that these are still questions is one of the reasons why the Western Balkans have not experienced the same transformative effect that EU accession prospects had in Central Europe in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Now, of course, one of the major reasons why this accession has been such a long time coming is because of course, of the war and the need for post-war reconstruction and reconciliation. But it's also because of the fact that the EU is less unified than it was in the 1990s. It's had many troubles of its own with 10 years of crisis, the economic crisis and then the migration crisis. And of course, the fact that it gets harder to become an EU member as the EU develops, as the EU becomes a more complicated organisation with more rules and regulations and new projects like the single currency and of course the Schengen area of passport-free travel. That makes it harder for countries to join. But there are also major problems in the region that have made it a very long journey, particularly persistent problems with rule of law, with administrative capacity, with poor governance. And EU membership should be a guiding light. It should be an incentive to resolve those problems. But the incentive just hasn't been strong enough to pull all of the political elites together towards the same goals. Plus, of course, there are other influences in the region these days. It's not just the European Union. There is no monopoly of influence in the Balkans, whereas in Central Europe, especially for the first decade of post-communist transition, the EU was the only game in town. And the massive incentives of joining the EU seemed to be only one electoral cycle away. It only seemed to be just beyond the next election. And that provided a massive incentive for system change. Plus, of course, there was a lot of foreign direct investment available because there was a lot of liquidity in global capital markets. It was a very different moment in the world economic cycle. So the Balkans has the odds stacked against it, but I think that everybody in the region will eventually join the EU. The question is whether it's possible to use that incentive of accession in order to bring about the improvements in governance, in rule of law, and in economic prospects that everybody in the region wants and needs.
So we talked about enlargement now and the state of affairs in the Western Balkans. Let's talk about the EU External Action Service and the role that human rights play on the agenda. If we look at the EU external actions, do you think that the promotion and protection of human rights is where it should be on the EU foreign policy priority list?
The EU has always had a commitment to human rights which is written into its founding documents, into the various treaties that have been agreed over the years. It's there in Article 2 of the current treaty in force. It still remains very important, but the question is, I think, really how much domestic politics in the European Union affect the EU's effectiveness as a global actor on values and on democratic norms. There is a tendency now for politicians going outside the EU and indeed representatives of the EU in diplomatic fora and so on to be more nervous about promoting norms and democratic values because they know that there are problems at home. When you have EU member states themselves saying, well, we're not convinced that Article 2 is the most important thing, and in fact rule of law is a contested term, for example, in the EU, it's much harder to represent a single voice of the European Union abroad. So it's the nexus between domestic political developments and foreign policy positions which is really at the heart of this. But if you look at public opinion and elite views on human rights, there's actually very consistent and stable support for them. People still care about rights a great deal. If you ask Europeans, as we've done recently in a survey project called Voices on Values, whether they still think that it's really important to have values such as human rights, rule of law, also media freedom, and representation of pluralistic views in Parliament, if you ask people about those issues directly, there is overwhelming public support for them across the European Union. But what we need is for EU diplomats and politicians to be rather more robust in defending those rights and promoting them externally.
Thank you very much. We would like to look at an internal issue that regards the European Union, and that's the rise of populism and how it affects open society. We have seen in recent years that populism has threatened human rights, democratic practices, and open societies' values. Can open societies in Europe withstand and reverse the rise of populism?
Populism is the dark side of democracy. It's a style of politics and a thin ideology that divides the world into what the populists claim are corrupt elites and the pure people, which is always there in a democratic debate. It's a view that is consistently there. The question is it a marginal voice that gets maybe 5% of the vote, or does it become a mainstream voice that gets 25 or 35% of the vote? And that's what has changed in recent years in Europe. The populism has gone from being a marginal part of the democratic debate to being a much more important and much more influential player. It does affect open societies in Europe because most populists tend towards wanting a society that is more divided and towards claiming that it's minorities who are to blame for the problems in the society, and they tend to blame in particular rather vulnerable minorities, migrants especially, but also ethnic minorities and vulnerable groups in the population. And that has an impact on the society as a whole because it increases intolerance, it reduces the capacity for social harmony, for people to get on together, to get on with their lives, to deal with changes in their communities, and it creates a culture of blame and a rhetoric of blame which infects the whole of politics. Now, I think the answer is not to just point the finger at the populists. The answer is for mainstream parties to retake those issues and to respond to the issues that voters are concerned about and to talk about how it's possible to have an integrated and socially inclusive set of policies that allow minorities and majorities, people of all different faiths and backgrounds, to live together. It's really about finding what people have in common that politics should be about. And that's the best way of putting populism back on the margins of politics.
Recently, the Institute, the Open Society European Policy Institute, published a paper about social media monitoring during elections. That being said, we also know that in recent years we've witnessed Russian meddling campaigns in elections across Europe. How can the EU prevent external meddlings through elections and protect its citizens from disruptive information operations?
Manipulation of elections, and especially disinformation, is becoming easier and easier to do because of the online public sphere and because of the role that social media plays in political debates. And to make sure that political debates are based on accurate information, that they are not post-truth, they are actually about the truth and they are about facts, you have to look both at the supply side and the demand side. So on the supply side, you have to look at where are people getting information from and how citizens can tell whether a source of information is credible and unbiased or not. So I think there the European Union has an important role in providing itself a guide to what are credible and realistic sources of information and what are not, and calling out the manipulation and exposing it. That's really important. National governments definitely need to do this as well. But there's also the demand side. You have to ensure that citizens are resilient to conspiracy theory, to misinformation, that citizens themselves have the capacity individually as well as collectively to see what's a good source of information and what's a biased source, to be able to check the facts for themselves. So citizen journalism is important in this. Definitely digital education and having a digitally literate electorate is a really important thing in a democracy these days. The people who it's easy to dupe are the ones who are really confused and can't tell a good source from a bad source. Hannah Arendt wrote in the 1930s that the ideal victim of communism or Nazi ideology is not the committed communist or the committed Nazi, but it's the people for whom the distinction between truth and falsehood, between reality and fiction, no longer exists. So it's really vital to ensure that the public has the capacity to tell the difference.
Dr. Grabbe, we would like to conclude this interview with a more personal question. You have been the director of the Open Society European Policy Institute for more than 10 years now, and we would like to ask you what has been the most gratifying aspect of your work as the director of the Institute and as the director of EU Affairs?
The last 10 years have seen some really scary developments in Europe for anybody who prefers to live in an open society, a liberal democracy, and a harmonious society where people get on with each other. We've seen the rise of intolerance and even hatred, not only hate speech, but violence in societies. We've seen some really traumatizing experiences of austerity and economic downturn, and of course, migration crisis that was fuel to the kind of populism that really divides societies. Plus, of course, the growth of disinformation, the growth also of authoritarianism, even within the European Union itself. These are really scary and worrying developments. But there's also a very positive view that the European Union has managed to focus now on two really important issues, climate and digital, which are transforming our societies and which have enormous impact on the openness of those societies. And the European Union has an infrastructure which allows it at a continental level to come up with long-term, multifaceted, comprehensive policies to serve the public interest on those issues, to tackle climate change effectively and to make sure that the transition to a low-carbon economy is fair and does not put the burden of adjustment primarily on households and consumers and those who can't lobby for their own interests, and also to regulate the digital sphere in the public interest, not in the interests of some tech companies that would like to make a lot of money out of the attention economy, but really in the public interest. So I still have a lot of faith in the idea that the European Union has assets that it can use to turn these enormous transformative trends in our societies for the good. It has money, it has the scale of 500 million people, it has the law, it has sticky agreements, it's good at doing international diplomacy and finding agreement with other countries around the globe. So we're living in darker days than 10 years ago, but I think that the European Union remains a bright point of light. And I really hope that the new Commission and Parliament and the new generation of politicians who are taking office will seize that opportunity and use it to the maximum.
Dr. Heather Grabbe, thank you very much for this insightful interview. It's been a pleasure and an honor.